So we're gonna talk about protecting privacy in the kingdom of data, but let me start with a story. So a few months ago, I met a startup CEO, and that startup was building an app for social networks, network for people with rare medical conditions. And in that app, people that use the app actually share, it's not working. It is working. So anyone for whom the headphones are not working, go to the back. So let me continue with the story. So on that medical app, the folks that use the app actually share a lot of information about their personal condition, kind of what medications they're using, what effects they're having, etc. Now, this was very, very interesting, but I asked the CDO, well, this is very, very personal. How do you protect this data? So he told me, don't worry. We don't actually use the person's name or their email. We're letting them use a nickname. Well, surely somewhere you have a database that connects, the person's email to their nickname. How do you protect, that database? So the next thing he told me was the one that prompted me to do this session. So what he told me was, well, we trust our employees. And I'm going to spend the rest of this talk trying to convince you that trusting your employees is at most, a wish, but definitely not a strategy. So let me start by introducing myself. So my name is WEINER, and I'm a senior engineering manager at Google. Recently, I returned to Israel. I'm based in Israel from 6 years in California, where I led the Google Search Analytics data warehouse. So I was responsible for a team that built the data modeling, data processing, storage for user activity for Google Search, Google Assistant, and Google Discover. And the data that we built was used both for analytics as well as for machine learning and ranking algorithms streaming back into search. And this is the time where I got exposed to the whole area of privacy and policy at Google, but also in the world. Since returning to Israel about a year ago, I joined Google Cloud, and today I lead Google Cloud Database Migration Service, where we help customers migrate from anywhere, from on-prem, from other clouds to Google Cloud. But first, before we proceed, let me share kind of a few headlines from the tech media, where the strategy of we trust our employees actually did go wrong. And I'm sure any one of you has many more examples than what I have to share. So let's start with Google. So Google, a few years ago, Google deprecated Google+, which was an external service. And in the process of this deprecation, what happened is that accidentally, personal data about a few users got exposed internally at Google. Now, a few users at Google scale ends up at 50+ million users. Now, this was identified by Google, reported out, and fixed within a week. And it actually occurred that no Google employee actually accessed this personal data. However, ended up on the front page, not very good publicity. Let me move on to Uber. So Uber, again, a few years ago, it was discovered that Uber employees spied on ex-partners, on Beyonce, on politicians. So unlike the previous use case, this is unintentional, but definitely not, a great thing to be on the front page of any tech media outlet. Let's move on to an even more severe case. Now, Twitter, not called Twitter anymore, X, with a recent number of employees, maybe they can go with, we trust our employee strategy today. But back in the day, what happened, this is like a real James Bond story. So 2 employees of Twitter X today were paid, 2 Saudi Arabian citizens were paid by the Saudi Arabia government to track and report location and other information about thousands of Saudi Arabian citizens. Now, this is definitely in the area where we don't want to be at. And the last example from the UK, Virgin Media. So what happened here is that they had a database with personal information which was incorrectly configured by one of the database admins, and actually a third-party provider that they used had access to this database. Now this was out there and exposed for about 10 months, ended up not just as something in the papers, but also very high fee for this, $4+ billion compensation payout. Now, why am I telling you, all these stories? Because all these stories ending up in the newspaper can harm the one thing that we all should treasure, and this is user trust. Because if there is no user trust, the users are not coming back, they're not paying us money, they're not renewing the contracts, the bottom line of the company goes down. Now, this is how we, the data people, can actually harm the business, and we don't want that to happen. So today I want to talk about privacy. So when we talk about privacy, what do we actually mean? And I want to talk about three distinct areas. I'm going to talk about three areas. The first one is data governance. The second one is insider risk reduction, like all the examples we just saw. And then we're going to conclude with policy compliance, which is for sure an area that we all love and like, but hopefully we're going to like it even more after the talk. So I'm going to start with data governance. So the first question I want you all to ask yourself is, what do I want to store, right? And there is one extreme, right? You ask any data engineer, and any company, is a data-driven company, of course, today, let's store everything. Everything we touch, all our user activity, let's store everything. For how long? Well, forever. How do we know? With all of this like UI, who knows when we're going to need it? So that's kind of the one extreme. And another extreme, if you ask any of the information security people, right? Ask the CISO. So if you ask the CISO of any large corporation, they're going to tell you, store nothing. And if you end up storing anything, delete it immediately, delete it tomorrow. Now, obviously, we don't want to be in any one of the extremes. We want to find somewhere the golden middle. So how do we do that? So the first thing you should look at is, what do you actually need? And how do you know what you need? Well, you ask yourself, do I know how this data is going to be used? And if you have a good answer to this question, then it's fine. It's okay, you can store it. But if you don't, use your judgment and try to store just the amount of data that you think you're going to need in the future. 2, your data that you decided to store, maybe, after a while you thought you're going to use it, but you don't actually use it. What do? Clean up your data. So make sure the data that's not useful anymore, and how do you know that it's not useful? You can look at the access. Was this data actually accessed in the last, week, month, 3 months? If it wasn't, pretty safe to delete it. And then, the same way that data can go stale, the way typically logging code evolves is append only, right? So if I want to log something, of course I log it. I never look back. So my logs, my user activity goes bigger and bigger and bigger. So if you end up cleaning your data, I also highly recommend cleaning your code as well. And that brings us to the data minimization principle. So this is the principle that says in the data governance domain, what we want to do is only keep the data we need, or only for as long as we think it's going to be useful. For whom? For our users. So how are we going to do that? So the first thing you want to do in order, not to end up in the New York Times front page is start by minimizing PII. So first of all, let me ask you, what is PII? So we'll start with the obvious. So the obvious is, name, email, credit card number, etc. But if I minimized the usage, the storage of this information, is that it? Now, let me give you a number. No, first, let me tell you a story about Netflix. So, 2008, for the old timers, for the elders, Netflix came up with a contest. And the contest was, Netflix going to share an anonymized data set of, did you like the movie, did you not like the movie? And it asked anyone in the world to come up with the best machine learning algorithm for predictions. Help Netflix predict what's the next movie that that any user is going to see. And there was a prize of $1 million for any team that will come up with that recommendation engine. So a lot of engineers, students started working on that machine learning algorithm. But there were two engineers in the University of Texas in Austin that said, you know what? You published an anonymized data set that only includes, upvotes, downvotes. Let us show you that it's not really anonymized. And within 2 months, they were able to de-anonymize the majority of the people in that data set. So anyone knows how they did it? One person, okay. Hold that thought. I'm going to tell everyone else at the end of the talk. Reminding you, there was no identifying information in that data set. And now let me share a statistic, an amazing statistic with you. So 87%, 9 out of 10 Americans can be uniquely identified in any data set by the 3 numbers. Their zip code, gender, female, male, and date of birth. Right? Isn't it amazing? In any data set, 9 out of 10 Americans can be identified, but this information, which is not really personal by itself. So what could we do to minimize PII and minimize the data that can lead to identifying people that we don't want to be identified, like Beyonce, by our employees unintentionally? So the first thing we can do is anonymization. What is anonymization? It's a technique to modify personally identifiable information when it's not going to be associated with a person. So instead of my email, some random number. Another technique is generalization. What is generalization? So instead of using an email which is highly identified with me, scratch all the emails and use something that's not unique to me, like email@gmail.com. And the idea behind these two is to get to a state where your data set is essentially k-anonymized. What does it mean, k-anonymized? It means for any query, it should return no less than k results. So no single person could be uniquely identified in your data set. Now, a side note, it could be done with anonymizing, generalizing your data, but it could also be done through the query engines. And I know there were a lot of talks today about query engines. So you can configure your query engine to actually not return results unless there is k or more results in the response. And the last technique I want to talk about is differential privacy. So differential privacy is a mathematical technique of adding noise to your data in a way where a single record being in the data set or out of the data set doesn't change the qualities of the data set. Now, this is a technique that I do not recommend to try out as the first thing you're doing. And if you do want to try it out, use open source libraries. Google has libraries, other providers as well. Now, we talked about minimizing PII. The second thing you should think about is retention, right? For how long do I want to store the information? Do you ask it yourself once? No, you will ask yourself for each and every data set that you have. If it's very, very granular, let's say it's our user activity logs, it's super critical for the business, right? Like customers reaching out, they cannot do something on my app or on my service. Obviously, I need the logs, but for how long? Right, the apps, the code is moving so fast. When does it go stale and essentially is meaningless? Maybe a week, maybe 3 weeks, maybe a month, but probably no more than that. While the data that's highly aggregated, and we're going to look at that, maybe can be stored forever. So for each and every data set, intentionally decide what's the retention you want to keep it. And now I want to talk about the granularity. So for every data set, keep it in the lowest granularity possible. And what do we mean by lowest granularity? So we start with the logs. So logs are essentially this bag of stuff, unordered, maybe unstructured, a lot of the data, but really hard to make sense of. We move on to user key data. So this is actually typically longitudinal, right? So when people are being, tracked, this is typically through these user keyed longitudinal data sets, so probably the most sensitive. And then we go to aggregated. What's aggregated? Anything powering our BI dashboards, executive dashboards, really safe, okay, probably okay to keep for a very long time. And this concludes the part of the data governance. We talked about what do we want to store, how do we want to store it, and what tools and techniques we can use to make that stored data, safer for us, for our company. And now I want to talk about insider risk reduction. So where do we start, right? We definitely don't want to be in any of the situations, we discussed at the beginning of the talk. So you start by mapping your threats. Start by pausing and thinking, well, I want to reduce the risk, but the risk of what? One example is, maybe I want to reduce the risk of my safe data going to third-party providers, right? Maybe that's not safe for me. Maybe I'm worried about mass data exfiltration. So in the keynote talk this morning, one statistic that was shared is that any data is copied in any org, any enterprise 5 times or more, right? So maybe that's what I'm worried of, that someone's going to take, my precious, single source of truth, copy it elsewhere, and then I don't know who has access and what's going to happen to it. Or maybe what I'm worried about is the ability to track or to access data about a specific user. And this goes back to, for example, this medical social network staff, right? So I never want my employees to be able to go to a specific user and access all of their medical history. So you start by ranking these threats and thinking, what am I afraid of the most? And once you have that, you start tackling them one by one. So I'm going to share a few things you could do to reduce that insider risk, right? We'll probably never get to 0, but we always want to be working to reduce that insider risk. So the first thing, and you will be surprised, it might sound not just reasonable, but of course we encrypt our data, but you will be surprised how many companies do not encrypt all of their data, structured and unstructured. What data should you encrypt? Everything, right? At rest, in flight. Once you've encrypted your data, are you done? Well, let me ask you, where is the key? Where do you store the encryption key? Well, answer number 1, right, most popular. Well, I'll store it together with the code, right? It will be in my source control. Well, this is as if, I locked my house, but I left the key, under the doormat. Does it make my house safe? Well, not really, right? So what should I do? And this is probably the only slide when I'm going to touch a bit of the security topics. So a few buzzwords that your customers might come to you, but it's very, very good for you to get to know them. So the first one is CMEC. So who manages the encryption key? So if I'm not putting my key, under the doormat, I can put it in a key store in my company. But maybe your customers want to tell you, no. I want to manage my encryption keys. So that's the CMEC. Then another one, and then it's more and more secure. So the second one is to use EKM, external key manager. So not only the customer provides you with a key, but also the customer wants to manage their key. And probably the strongest one, this is KAJ. This is a key access justification. So every time anyone has access to the key, log it and report it. So we'll have to move a bit faster. So the next one is role-based access. So instead of giving access to a specific person, one thing you could do is to give access to a role. What happened with Twitter and the Saudi Arabia employees is that one of them was a customer engineer. So they had access to everything. Then they moved to a different role, but their access was retained. So this is something that you do not want to happen. Fine-grained access. Not all your data is equally sensitive. So if in a data set you have some personal information like credit card number or their name, their address, keep only these columns, only these parts of the data very, very secure. Log access to the data and audit these access logs. So suddenly, of course, in an automated manner, right? Like nothing should be manual. So you should have some mechanism to look at who accesses what types of data, what types of queries are your employees running, and of course be able to ask some questions. And of course, what about generative AI? So let me start with some good news. So the good news is anything we're going to talk about applies to the data relevant for generative AI as well, but there are also a few differences. So number one, AI systems are more complex. They include the model, the data training pipelines, the application. Number two, they're more data-driven. Now you can ask yourself, how much more data-driven can you be? Well, the essence of generative AI is the data. They're adaptive. This is very, very new technology, so everything is changing very, very fast, which means if you're doing your mapping your threats, you'll have to do it again and again, more frequently than the kind of more stable systems. And the last one, more interconnected. Tons of third-party providers, many of them presenting here. So it's very likely your data is actually you're gonna use some third-party provider, vector databases, ML model builders, etc. What can you do? What principles should you apply for generative AI specifically? And this is taken from Safe Principles, that paper that was published by Google. So the first thing, try to bring the model to the data rather than export all your data to the model. Obviously, if possible, that would be safer. Number two, sandbox the LLM. So make sure that the data that the model is going to be trained off, your company's proprietary data, is only going to be used for the LLM for your company, that it's never going to leak into the general training for the LLM. And number three, control access to that LLM that was trained on your proprietary data, right? So that your company's LLM should never be accessible to anyone outside of your company. So we concluded the section of insider risk reduction, and I really want to move on to the next session. And what I want you to think about is that building your data warehouse, data lake, you name it, without thinking about privacy and policy upfront might end up in this kind of situation with this poor bridge. So of course we're going to talk about policy compliance. So let me start with a few examples, and I'm sure these buzzwords are very, very familiar to each and every one of you. GDPR has the UK version of GDPR, HIPAA, the regulations for storing medical information, medical data. CCPA is a new one, so California Consumer Privacy Act. 2023, the regulation's out, only applies to people who live in California. If you care about these folks, you should be familiar with that. And there's a new regulation coming in the UK, right? The Digital Information Bill. So you are probably more familiar with this than me. Now, this is kind of boring, right? Like, what's in it for me? Why are you talking to me about this? So, number one, you should be doing is to be very, very clear in your domain what regulations, what compliance regulations apply to your data. Now, whether you're compliant or not, this is less critical. In many of the regulation compliance domains, it's okay to have a plan to get to the compliance and not actually be compliant today. So that's thing number one. Number two, once you have this registry, I'm compliant, my company is compliant to this, not compliant to that. Number two, you as data engineers, right, as data officers can build the infrastructure and the tools so it will be really, really easy for anyone else accessing the data, writing the pipelines, to do the right thing. For anyone new, building a new database or a new data pipeline to be compliant by default. And educate. Who do you educate? Everyone, people on your teams, feature engineers, the execs in this domain. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is a bit of a career advice that I couldn't avoid, is whenever there is a new regulation, coming out, volunteer, right? Who's going to, handle, there is a new privacy bill coming up. Who's going to, help us understand what we need to do? Volunteer. Why? Because you might think this is boring, but I can tell you that the execs, the CEO of the company, with that $44 billion bill, trust me, they're going to care, and they're going to care a lot. So this is your opportunity, one, to get access to these execs, make an actual impact, but also get a very good understanding of the data sets that your company has and owns. And I'm going to summarize this talk. So we talked about the 3 domains in the privacy area. So we talked about data governance. How do you store the data? What do you store? How do you think about minimizing the chance of getting to that front page? We talked about insider risk reduction, right? Inside, how do I make sure that my employees from my company do not use this data for anything that it's not intended for? And the third pillar is the policy compliance, why you should actually be familiar with that and strive to work on it. So we're not going to conclude before I tell you about the Netflix. So remember, anonymized data set with just like upvotes, downvotes. So what turned out is that while Netflix anonymized this data set, there was another data set out there, on the internet, and that's the IMDb data set. And what they discovered is that there is a very, very high correlation between the people, upvoting, downvoting on Netflix and the people upvoting, downvoting in IMDb. And IMDb is not anonymized. People provide their maybe the location they live, maybe their nickname, maybe even their real name, and birthday. So what they did, they correlated between the 2 databases, and by this, they were able to de-anonymize a large portion of that, seemingly anonymized data set. Now, hopefully, this and other, facts made you think. Thank you very much. You've been amazing.